big misconception of being independent actually really hinders their ability of adding value to the organization. Also, normally people in the first line do not have the expertise or knowledge on how really remediate gaps, how to deal with new threats that they haven't seen before. So that is where the value of working together is key for the second line.
This episode is brought to you by Green Skies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Green Skies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Green Skies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. Today on the show, we have a first for the Audit Podcast. We have 3 guests. We've done 2 at a time. This time we had 3. So I'll get to their intros here in a second. But what we're talking about is this article that they wrote. So they're all from Grant Thornton, and they wrote this article called Risk Management, Get Your 3 Lines in Order. And it's largely about demystifying the 3 lines for each line and understanding what each one's role is in risk management. I know when I was in internal audit and was working with, especially when 3 lines came out, I know one of the things for me, I was like, what is difference between us and compliance? I was like, I don't really get it. What are they? It seems like we kind of do the same thing. I'm on this compliance committee and it seems like they're testing things like we're testing things. So I know for me, it was pretty confusing. I think it could be extremely helpful. I guess the way I would use this episode instead of maybe just passively listening to it, I would take it, listen to it. If you want to share the episode with your team, that's great. Hardly necessary. But I would at least take the article. It's a 5-ish minute read. Share that with your team and have some level of discussion to make sure that everyone on the team knows, okay, first line, this is what they're responsible for. Second line is this. This is our role in internal audit relative to risk management, so that everybody kind of knows what's going on. I think that can add a lot of clarity into what we're doing, as well as potentially sharing it with the second line. Sharing it with the first line might be pretty difficult considering how many people are in the first line, but even maybe during kickoff calls, you're kicking off an audit and going, hey, and I don't know, go first, second, third line to the degree you feel like you might need to, but go, this is kind of like your role, first line, in risk management. And even saying, there's this common misconception that it's not a first line function, when in actuality, they're like the main reason, like the main part of all this. So with that said, we'll jump into it. We have Andres Castañeda. He is the Florida Risk Services Leader, again from Grant Thornton. Jaynitsa Paul, who's the Senior Manager of Advisory Services at Grant Thornton, and EJ Jimenez, who's the Manager of Advisory Services at Grant Thornton. So the 3 of them are the authors of this article, and so we want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the article itself. Again, it's linked in the show notes, so go check that out. Honestly, you could just stop listening to this, go check that out. I think there's some good stuff in the episode, though, that might add some additional clarity. Some of the things that we hit on are for each line of defense, we said, what are the common misconceptions that they see with their clients, and understanding each role in the first, second, third line. And then what I thought would be really helpful is if we took any given risk and control, or any given control and the risks associated to it, and said, all right, let's see, what is the first line's role for this control, second line, third line. And then we took it a step further, and the guest did a really good job of putting this together, building out a RACI matrix for this, for each one of the lines of defense there. And so I'd highly recommend, for that part specifically, I would pull up this episode on the YouTube channel. Jaynitsa shares her screen where she put together this RACI matrix and a slide or 2 after that as well. And so I think being able to visually see it, obviously, and then hear it would be really, really impactful in making it kind of cement it into your brain. So I would highly recommend going to check out at least that clip from the YouTube video. And we kind of close it with, where have you seen a first, second line defense where it works well? and the value that it added. And then also, and these are real world examples, where have you seen it not work out so great, and what were the consequences of that? So with that said, thank you again, the three folks from Grant Thornton. This was a really fun one to do, especially having three folks on there. With that said, here we go. So I've been asking pretty much everybody this over the past year, especially with the more we've seen the use of ChatGPT, and so just either ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, or if Grant Thornton has your own LLM that you all use, something like that, whether it's personal or professional use, what has been maybe a good prompt or a good use for you here recently?
That was a great question, and I had to look at my record for the last 6 months. In 89% of the usage has been to either enhance, fine-tune, or check for completeness solutions that I have developed for clients, which is really shocking to me. I've been doing this for 26 years. It's incredible that just spending a minute or two with GenAI is able to enhance and allow me to provide better services to my clients. We develop a GenAI solution, Comply AI. So that is also something that we leverage across. So it's incredible that a first year associate is able to get the knowledge that it took me 26 years to gather. So it's also, I think, something that all practitioners should be fully aware is, again, you have your experience, it's not going to replace us, but it allows to fine tune and provide better services to our clients.
So I'll go a little bit more recent. So over the holidays, I was searching. I also went back into my history and I searched out of office replies so that I have a good out of office reply for being out for 2 weeks, completely disconnected. I also searched white elephant gift ideas because I think this tool is just amazing to just alleviate all of the brain fog, right? So you already know what you're looking for, but the time it would take to just think and think and think, it's so easy. Put in the prompt, and it was actually the white elephant gift ideas was for a friend of mine, and I shot it over to her, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, that was so fast." I didn't tell her I used ChatGPT, but it was like so quick, and I didn't have to like crap my brain for that. So those are like probably my more recent personal searches.
I really like the out of office one. Usually because and you all probably do it also, where like you'll take a vacation of sorts, but then you'll probably like, well, I'll check email. It's not, I'll just stay up to date on email. But then there's always those, at least for me, at least twice a year, I try to take like a solid week where it's like, I'm not checking email, LinkedIn, anything like that. And so my out of office is usually something to the effect of, I'm taking a legit vacation. I am not replying to any emails. I'll see you in 2 weeks or whatever it is.
I like that.
And on a more personal level, I use it for one of my hobbies. I'm actually a huge fan of the financial markets. So on the weekends, I use it to analyze trends of charts or to teach me technical analysis. I don't fully rely on it, but I find it fascinating that with such a tool, it can make complex subjects easier to understand. And that's one way that I use it on the weekends. It has helped me a lot, and it's just fascinating.
Yeah. Hobby usage is something that I think it didn't take a backseat, but at first it was just like work. And then you went, oh, you know what? I can use this for myself also. I've used it to have difficult conversations with my kid. Like for you guys that are, you want the most, it's just like for your kid to tell you what's going on. And so I've even used it to have, like what questions can I use to ask my kid to get him to tell me what's going on. So, yeah, fantastic. Very nice there. All right, let's move on to the kind of the topic at hand. So I know you guys had recently written a white paper, and we'll link to that. And so that's kind of the basis of the conversation that we're going to have today. So for more on, folks can look for the link to that in the show notes. But from that, some questions that I think would be helpful for new, even veteran auditors who maybe just haven't wrapped their head around this is relative to the lines of defense. And so your white paper was around common misconceptions. So let's break it down into, all right, for each line of defense, can you kind of highlight the most common misconceptions that your client as a way to maybe help others understand exactly what it is that these three lines of defense are, and provide some more clarity around those.
Perfect. So let me start with that, and let's maybe use the analogy of a battlefield. First line is the front lines. It's infantry on the front. They deal, the enemy is risk. They're dealing with risk every single day. They figured out new techniques to manage new threats. They see a level of detail that no one else sees. So the biggest misconception, and we see this for really small companies to multi-billion-dollar companies, is that first line is not responsible for risk management. It has no responsibility for controls.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, that's
in first
the
line.
biggest one.
Hey, we don't need anything to do with this. Yep.
Yeah, we have nothing to do with risk management. We have nothing to do with controls. For me, that's the biggest misconception, because no one knows the level of detail that they do. No one knows the threats at the levels that they do. They are, even when we talk to clients, they are the ones that are sometimes able to tell us when something has gone wrong in the design of controls or risk management, because they see the one-offs. The one in 1,000 cases, they're able to see it. No one else is able to do that. So that is the first key misconception, is first line has no responsibility for risk management. First line is not responsible for controls. Now, following with that analogy, if we move to the second line, for me, second line is the command post, is artillery, it has a better vantage point, is able to see the entire battlefield, not just one front line. They're able to understand risk across the organization. So they have a better view of not only specific departments or business units, but they're able to see across. They also have the ability of seeing some of the emerging risks. So the biggest misconception that I see on that perspective is some second lines, internal controls or risk management or compliance functions, believe that they need to be independent from the first line. So that is, again, is the main source of data for second line has to be the level of information that flows every day for the first line. So second line, risk management, compliance, even cybersecurity groups that they have. Again, that is a key part, because they have to work hand in hand. They're able to collaborate with the first line. They're able to provide the first line a perspective that is wider to the day-to-day, because they are able to look at risk in a holistic perspective. So yes, the second line, the big misconception of being independent, actually really hinders their ability of adding value to the organization. Also, normally people in the first line do not have the expertise or knowledge on how really remediate gaps, how to deal with new threats that they haven't seen before. So that is where the value of working together is key for the second line. Now, if we move to third line is in the battlefield will be the guys back in the command post, inspectors. So those are the internal auditors. They have to be independent. But on this one, I will want to use two misconceptions. One on the side of management and one on the side of the internal audit practitioners. On the side of management, there's still to this day many management groups that expect internal audit to be responsible for the remediation and addressing gaps or owning the remediation of gaps that they identify. Again, that would impair their independence and that objectivity that adds value to whatever they provided. So yeah, that's a big misconception. On the side of in my opinion, on the side of practitioners, internal audit practitioners, a big misconception, there's still many practitioners that perceive themselves as being a compliance cop. That used to be the old model. Now we all practitioners, we should move into being trusted advisors. Let's see how we can add value to the organization, given the fact that, again, internal auditors are able to see the entire organization. They get access to data, which is one of the big differences compared to other lines. They gather data across the organization. If you're able to analyze that data, instead of just looking in the rear view mirror, you'll be able to help the organization forecast or foresee risk that may be coming up, emerging risks. And also, they could help suggest to the organization options that they have to remediate gaps or how they could structure better, not implement, but be part of the discussion on how to address any issues that are identified.
I like the analogies for each one, and especially I was talking to someone, a CAE, where internal audit is fairly new, or at least this approach, maybe the modern day internal audit approach is fairly new. So new CAE at this organization. And so they're basically having to change the perception of audit and risk in general. And so I really think, being kind of armed, I'm going to share this episode with them, being armed with that analogy. And then where I'd like to take this next also, like I think it'd be really helpful for people to take this and be able to talk to various stakeholders and go first, second, third line. This is how we think about it. And here's
And again, the other part is key. Again, collaboration across all lines is how this works. Right now, we live in an environment that is really dynamic. Things are changing really fast. So that continuous communication is the key. Even if you're well-established lines, if there's no sharing information between first line, second line, third line, things are happening at such a pace that it cannot be the static structure that maybe you could use 5 years ago. So that's the other key. Communication and coordination across all lines is the key to success for risk management.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of summarize it. Overall is first, second, third, but if you don't have the communication between the three, then it doesn't really matter if you know the difference between them or not. It's not going to be nearly as effective. Hey everybody, we'll get back to the guests, but real quick, just wanted to let you know, block your calendars for March 5th, 2025. If you attended the Audit Analytics and AI conference back in the fall, we're going to do a mini Audit Analytics and AI conference on March 5th. So it's going to be from 9 to 4. So we're going to go 9 to 12. Then we'll do an hour break, and then 1 to 4. These are Central Time, so Chicago time zone. All right, so go ahead, block your calendars off, and we'll make the announcement when registration opens. All right, back to the show. All right, that's perfect. So what I would like to do then, the folks that are going, great analogy, give me something very concrete. I would kind of like to go through that. So if we could basically take like a control, the risk associated to it, and go, okay, for this control, which then you could extrapolate across other controls, of course. This is what the first line's responsibility is, second line responsibility, third line responsibility, and what do they actually do for any given control. So I'll kind of throw it back to you guys if you want to start with the first.
So I'm going to actually share my screen here.
And so for those that don't know, we do have the full episodes on YouTube. And so for reasons just like this, where sometimes it does help to share a screen, show a slide or two. So if you are listening to this in the audio, use your imagination. And then maybe if you need to see it, pop over to the YouTube version of it. But with that said, go ahead.
Yes. So the example that we will go through is for a physical inventory control.
Okay.
So for those who are not able to see the screen, I'm just going to go ahead and read this example control. Annually, warehouse personnel perform a full physical inventory of raw materials, work in progress, and finished goods inventory on-site and at third-party locations. Following the inventory, count policies and procedures for performing line counts. Count sheets are reconciled to the perpetual inventory. Variances are noted above defined thresholds and are recounted, verified, and adjusted in accordance with policy. All pre-count and post-count inventory reports, count sheets, count results, summaries, and adjustments are reviewed and signed and dated by the warehouse personnel and plant manager and retained. Evidence of review should include tick marks, comments, or other markings which are retained on the inventory SharePoint. And so this really goes through a very comprehensive physical inventory count control. So what we put together, as you mentioned, is the RACI for such a control that can really make this tangible.
And
So
real
you have
quick,
your
before you go further, can you, for those that don't know what a RACI matrix is, can you kind of describe what the RACI is? And that's RACI, again, for those that are listening.
So the RACI, R stands for responsible, A stands for accountable, C stands for consulted, and I stands for informed. And essentially in a RACI matrix, you will have different individuals or departments, teams that would be listed on the matrix and either having ownership or whether it's responsibility, accountable, consulted, or informed based on the activities that are listed on the RACI. So with this table here, there are activities listed based on the physical inventory control. So going through, preparing for the inventory count, performing the physical count, the reconciling the count sheets, performing the recounts and verifying variances, and all the way down through reporting out the significant inventory issues and evaluating the inventory control framework. And so each level or each line of defense has an area of responsibility, consultation, being informed, or being accountable. So the first line, as Andres mentioned, in this example would be the warehouse personnel and plant managers who are on site physically performing the inventory count. So in the RACI table, there's a lot of responsibility that the first line has because they are the ones performing the work, right? So they are the ones preparing for the inventory, physically performing the blind counts, performing the recounts, and then going down to retaining the documentation and reviewing and approving for any of those adjustments or variances. So really, those who are performing the inventory count and who are on site have the greatest responsibility, and that is the first line. Then the second line, which would be the risk and compliance function. So if there's an internal controls department or a compliance department, majority of the areas in the RACI and the activities, you are going to be consulting with the second line or informing the second line regarding performing the physical inventory count. In some of the activities, the second line is accountable or possibly responsible for. So when it says accountable, for example, here, adjusting the records for verified variances, you may reach out to the second line to get consultation or advice on what you are identifying as the first line, what has been identified as a variance. Other examples of what the second line would be responsible for in this physical inventory control would be around the reporting of any significant inventory issues to management. So second line serves right alongside with management, and they are collaborating very closely and partnering with the first line. And so after the results of the physical inventory count has been released, they are reporting that to management. And they're also responsible for evaluating the overall inventory control framework. So within this example, there were so many different pieces. So there are several procedure steps, including the policy around the inventory counts and who is to perform what as far as the recounts, as far as who's responsible for the reconciliations or approving variances. What is the threshold that is in the policy? So the second line, which is that risk and compliance line, they are responsible for evaluating, is the physical inventory control framework acceptable? Are there gaps in that framework? Are there gaps in the policy that they can work with management and the first line to close and to better that control and better the process? Then moving to the third line, which is your internal audit department, the third line is primarily informed of the physical inventory controller, the physical inventory count that's being performed. So all of the activities or majority of the activities that are being performed by the first line that's responsible for The third line is being informed of such activity. So they're being informed of when the counts will be performed, what the count policies are, who is involved, as well as the documentation of the results. You are informing the third line about those. Now, the third line also has some responsibility within the RACI if they come in to do and perform independent reviews of the inventory control. So your third line, being independent, can come in and say, okay, we want to test this control, so show us the documentation, show us your count sheets, show us your variances and who performed the recount and who approved that the variance, if it was above the threshold, was appropriate and they signed off on it. And then have you actually retained that evidence? So first line, some connecting between the first, second, and third, because it's all interconnected, right? Although each have their own, items that they're responsible, accountable, or consulted and informed on, they're still all connected. So with the third line coming in to perform their independent review, you want to make sure that the first line has retained all of that documentation and they have the evidence readily available. So in the example, it included where that evidence would be retained on an inventory SharePoint. If you retain physical paper copies, are there specific folders, specific binders, file cabinets, or are documents stored offsite at a warehouse somewhere? And how is that labeled so that when the third line comes in to perform their review, how can you easily access that evidence and documentation for them to perform their procedures? And then we also have in this RACI the board or governing body, who is primarily informed of all of the activities. In this example, being a physical inventory count, this would primarily be around a manufacturing company or possibly an e-commerce company, anyone that's actually holding inventory. So the board will want to primarily know, because if you're in that kind of industry, then revenue and sales are the primary key indicator that the board wants to know, right? And so your inventory accuracy and completeness is critical. So the board and the governing bodies, whether it's the audit committee or even if it's a private company performing this control, you would could have a board or senior executives would be informed of these results. And then overall, the board is accountable to the overall internal control framework as well. Is this working? Does everyone know what they're responsible for and how it ultimately impacts the company?
All right, so I think this is fantastic. I love when we can go into a lot of detail on any given question, especially when it's laid out like this. But then I also think it can help a lot of folks to just bring it back up to the high level and go, all right, for any given control, first line does this, second line responsible for this, third line this, and then board or governing body this. So could you kind of do that for each one of these four also?
So we have a bit of a summary here on kind of condensing the activities and who's responsible or accountable for those activities from this example. So from the operational execution, the first line is, I would say, 10 out of 10 times going to be responsible, correct, executing on the control. And also tying into the white paper that we wrote, oftentimes first line is just performing their procedures. They're doing their day-to-day job and not even recognizing potentially that this is a control. So also connecting the fact that the operational execution, what you are doing, actually is a control. You may not call it a control as you are, ticking off or scanning a barcode to count. You may not see that as a control. You see it as, this is my job to ensure that we know how much inventory is in this warehouse. But upper management and the second line and third line were like, oh, that's a control. So It's also connecting the dots there as well, so that folks know their day-to-day job actually is a part of the bigger picture, right? So secondly, the compliance with inventory policies and procedures, that is primarily going to be with the second line. Your first line is accountable for actually doing the execution, so they have to be in compliance while they're executing, and then consulting with the second line on, does this policy actually mitigate the risk? Does this policy, or is this policy in line with overall what the company's targets are? So that's where the second line is primarily consulted. Also, the second line can work with the first line. As Andres mentioned, they are not independent. So they can work with the first line to see, okay, where are some gaps in the process or in the policy that need to be filled in. And so the second line being compliance, they have more of that understanding and awareness. And so they can provide those insights. So that's why they should be consulted. Then the monitoring and adherence to the policies is really going to be, again, with the second line. And it ties in with the fourth point here, where the third line is more responsible for the independent assurance. So the independent review and testing of the controls and of the compliance with the governing framework. And then lastly, this is a summary here, the board, they're informed. That is their primary role within this example of the RACI. They're just being informed of the results. So that's kind of the summary there. And then I will actually go back so that we can kind of, for those who are looking at the screen, they can see, okay, here are the more details and how it ties in with the summary.
Perfect. And I think where confusion can be had, I certainly had this in internal audit, I would go, is compliance responsible for this, or are we responsible for this? And even looking at your matrix right here, that bottom line, evaluate overall inventory control framework, the one at the very end, there's responsibility for second and third line. And so I know I would just be like, what? I don't know the difference between compliance and audit at this point. I get so much in the details of like, what are we supposed to, what's the difference between, maybe I could just ask it like that. What is the difference between compliance and internal audit? Because it seems like, and even looking at the RACI matrix, they're responsible for the exact same thing in some of these activities.
Yes. So that's actually a perfect and great call out. So compliance is management. Third line, and that's second line. So they are part of management. And if someone were to pull up the IIA 3 lines model, there's a visual of it. They will see under the management box, first line and second line roll up to management. Separately, third line is completely independent, and so they have to do independent procedures, independent reviews, and testing. And so with the example that you called out here, evaluating the overall inventory control framework, the second line, being a part of management, wants to ensure, and that's why they are responsible for this, they want to ensure that the controls are effective before the third line comes in. Like, you never want your independent regulator or third party coming in and finding your issues before you found them, right? So that's really the difference. Having that second line to help to identify any issues, any deficiencies or ineffective controls, processes, or procedures, or even policies, helps so that the first line and second line can work together to remediate and make those controls effective before your internal auditor, or even your possibly your external auditor, comes in and identifies those issues. So that's why they both have responsibility, but their responsibilities are still different. And there is a bit of duplication, right? Because second line has to also test and make selections, and probably is going to, be a part of the physical inventory count or request the evidence after the fact. And then the internal auditors are going to do the same. So it does feel like duplication, but it's really that separation of, when second line requests, that's a part of management. We're trying to help identify any issues or just ensure that the control is effective before the third line does, because the third line does not report to management, and third line reports to the board. So they are going, they will just simply say, we found a deficiency, here it is, you go remediate. So it's better that the second line identifies that and works with the first line to remediate before the third line comes in.
All right. All right. So I think now we hit on like the common misunderstandings that we've hit on. Sorry, hold on. Let me take this back 1 second. All right. So we've hit on the most common misconceptions, and I think we all know really first, second, third line, even board roles, responsibilities, and where those sit now. So probably a pretty clear understanding now. So now I'm kind of curious, EJ, if you want to step in and take this one. Where have you seen like those misunderstandings that are wrong, and what's been the consequence of we'll call it ignorance for lack of better words, and misunderstanding the three lines of defense?
Yeah, happy to take on that one. So this misunderstanding is very common across all organizations, but I've seen this being even more common on organizations that operate across different countries. A couple of years ago, we were working with an US-based company that they had brought us in order to help them with some issues that their external auditors had found. So they had issues across different processes, and just to follow the same example as Jaynitsa, one of the processes was inventory. So for the first line, the warehouse employees, they thought that their job was really just to count the stock. They were not taking into consideration the recount, reconciling any differences, even though that they had established policy. So after different interviews and inspecting evidence, we noticed that we proceeded to have conversations with the second line. The second line was based in the US, and due to the COVID-19 and the work from home policies, they stopped traveling to all these countries in Latam. So what ended up happening is that the second line assumed that just because there were policies in place, they thought that these policies were being followed. And you know the famous saying in audit, trust but verify. So that wasn't really happening. And then by the time the third line was involved, it was already too late. The consequences were material weakness by the external auditors and also operational delays in order to streamline the processes across all the countries in Latam and make sure that the controls were relevant on each of the countries.
Excellent. And then I'm going to ask EJ, you can take this, or Jaynitsa, if you want to take this also. So EJ, you mentioned external audit. Where did they fit in the three lines? We'll say three lines plus the board, maybe. So where would they fit in?
So external audit is almost outside of the matrix, but they are also independent. So because your external auditors are hired by the company, they don't actually work within the company at all. You could consider them part of third line, because third line is the independent section or the independent line that is performing testing. So your external auditors could be considered as part of third line. But truly, when you look at, again, the IIA three lines model, that visual, the external auditors are kind of off to the side, and they also will report to the board and report findings to management, but they are separate.
Okay. And I heard EJ mention external audit, and so when I'm sure somebody's brain that's listening to this go, well, we didn't even mention those guys in the three lines, and so I just wanted to answer that for those that are probably thinking or maybe thinking of that same question themselves. So okay, perfect. Thank you very much. All right, EJ. So that's what can happen, like if it goes wrong. Where misunderstanding not be misunderstood, and everybody's on the same page. We know first, second, third line. We know our roles, responsibilities, what we're accountable for, where we should be consulted. Maybe there's not a formal RACI for every control like that. I seriously doubt there is. But for those that get it right, and maybe another way to say this is, what's the benefit, or where have you seen a benefit of, hey, we're all on the same page. We know what we're supposed to be doing here. We understand our roles relative to this, to the three lines. What's the benefit, or where have you seen that gone right?
Yeah, and we can use the same example, the same organization. After we started working with them, we took an educational approach across all the three lines. And for instance, for the first line, for inventory, we sat with the key personnel involved in the process, and we walked through the control matrix. We showed them each control. We told them exactly what we were expecting or what was best practices as evidence for each of the controls. And we also educated them in the sense that these controls belong to them. These controls did not belong to internal audit or the internal controls team. They were responsible for the controls. We also showed them a couple of the issues that had happened during the prior years and how those issues impacted the financial statements. So once we helped them to connect the dots, they were able to realize that their day-to-day task is not really just task, is more like vital controls for the health of the organization. For the second line, management took a different approach. They ended up hiring additional personnel, bilingual personnel, in order to start traveling to the sites and become a strategic partner to the business units. So pretty much to make sure that they were trusting and verifying what the business units were supposed to be doing. And if something came up, the business units will bring it up to the second line's attention in order to help them. And then for the third line, internal audit took an approach in investing in technology and tools in order to monitor different areas of the business. And that will help them to be more proactive than reactive because, internal audit departments, they have their annual plan and sometimes that's what they stick with. But these tools will help them to see unusual variances, or if something looked unusual, they will go ahead and attack it at first hand rather than waiting until the end of the year to look at it. So that was one approach that they took. And the benefit of that was pretty much just taking this on an educational approach across the organization and helping them to understand that risk, it's not the responsibility for only one person. It's a shared responsibility across everyone in the organization.
I'm glad you mentioned the tools, and you don't have to mention specific vendors at all, but I know for a lot of folks, myself included, when somebody goes, I had a problem, I got this tool, I think, let me just go get that tool that's going to solve my problem. Obviously, you have to implement that you developed within that tool to actually make it effective. So again, and you can mention vendors if you want to. I personally don't really care, but maybe high level, what kind of tools are we talking here that were able to help?
They implemented different tools across data analytics, and that will help them to see unusual specific items and thresholds across different processes. And that will give them a full view of what was happening in the company.
As we start to wrap up, I felt like this would have been a good, maybe first 10 episodes to foundational audit type education, because I think there is a lot of people who are still confused on the 3 lines of defense. And so here we are, almost year 5 going into this before we got it. So very much for reaching out to me and telling me that you had the paper. Again, that's in the show notes for those that want to read more about this. It's linked in the show notes, but thank you. We should have, again, this should have been a Audit 101 type of one of the first 10 episodes that we probably published, or topics that we published. And I really think this has helped clear the air for a lot of people. So thank you all very much for not only the thought I can tell that you put into it to simplify this, but then also the effort that you put into, the handful of slides that you showed. I think that is really, really helpful visual for people to finally go, that's what, say 3 lines, that's what it means. And that's first, second, third. That's what we're talking about here. So again, thank you all very much for that. With that said, I want to give you a chance as we kind of wrap up to give the floor to you and close this out. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with?
I'll do that on behalf of the team. First of all, again, Trent, thank you for the opportunity of being here. Actually, this is one of the concepts that we see people struggling with, even really multi-billion-dollar organizations that struggle with this. So I think, thank you for bringing this to the forefront. I want to leave this with my motto for the year: pay it forward. Let's be agents of positive change. Let's help people that need at this time. Any way that you can help with time or money to the people in LA as they're going through those catastrophic fires, please help someone in need in your community, church, workplace. Let's start a wave of positive change around us. And that's one of the things that I want to leave the audience with.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.